The sun was warm that afternoon and the charity gala was the talk of the city. Expensive cars rolled up one by one outside the elegant hotel. The red carpet stretched out under the golden light and photographers stood in a long line clicking their cameras at every person who arrived. Guests wore expensive dresses, shining suits, and elegant jewelry. Everyone was excited to be seen there. It wasn't just another event, it was a gathering of powerful business people, celebrities, and leaders. And among them, the billionaire and his wife were the most respected couple in the room. His wife walked in wearing a simple but beautiful black dress that flowed softly with every step she took. She didn't need diamonds or loud colors to draw attention. People turned their heads because there was something warm and calm about her presence. She smiled at everyone who greeted her, and she made even the most nervous guest feel comfortable. Many people whispered about how kind she was. She had helped fund schools, hospitals, and programs for families in need. She wasn't just the billionaire's wife. She was loved and admired in her own right. Inside the grand hall, the air smelled like fresh flowers. Golden lights sparkled on the ceiling, and a soft orchestra played in the background. Guests held glasses of sparkling water and stood in small groups, chatting and laughing. The billionaire stood near the stage, talking with a few guests. His wife moved through the crowd, greeting old friends, shaking hands, and making sure everyone felt welcomed. She carried herself with quiet grace, never rushing, never showing off. But in the middle of this beautiful night, there was someone else watching her closely. It was a woman in a bright red dress. She had been one of the event sponsors, a businesswoman with a quick temper and a habit of wanting attention. She wasn't used to sharing the spotlight with anyone, especially someone who received more respect and admiration than her. She had been quietly complaining to people near her, making bitter comments about how everyone always admired the billionaire's wife. In her heart, jealousy grew like a storm. As the orchestra played softly, the billionaire's wife made her way toward a group of guests near the center of the hall. The woman in red stepped forward from the side. A few people noticed her, but no one expected what was about to happen. She walked fast, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Her face was tight with frustration. Some people thought she was just going to greet her. But as she reached her, everything changed in a single second. The woman in red raised her hand. There was no warning, no word exchanged, nothing. A sharp sound echoed across the room. The hand connected with the billionaire's wife's cheek. It was a slap that froze the air. It was so unexpected that even the orchestra stopped playing. People gasped and turned their heads. The sound seemed to echo again and again in the silence. The billionaire's wife stood completely still. Her eyes opened wide for a second, not because of pain, but because of shock. She slowly lifted her hand to touch her cheek. It was as if the world around her had paused. Guests stared in disbelief. Some covered their mouths. A waiter stopped mid-step, almost dropping the tray he was holding. Even the security guards at the back were frozen for a second, trying to process what they had just seen. The woman in red seemed to realize almost instantly what she had done. Her face lost its color, and her confident posture began to crumble. She had acted out of pure emotion, and now the whole world was watching her. A few people whispered loudly, while others took out their phones, not to film for entertainment, but because they couldn't believe what had just happened. The billionaire, who had been near the stage, turned around fast when he heard the noise. His eyes went straight to his wife. He pushed through the small crowd of guests who tried to make way for him. His security team followed quickly. Everyone could see the look on his face, not wild anger, but something colder, sharper. He reached his wife and gently placed a hand on her arm. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stood there with calm, quiet dignity. The woman in red took a small step back. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. The whispers grew louder. One guest near the back whispered to another, "She just slapped the billionaire's wife." Another whispered back, "She's finished." The woman's hands began to shake. Her proud smile was gone. Her eyes moved around the room, searching for someone to defend her, but no one said a word. The security team stood close, ready to act, But the billionaire's wife lifted a hand gently to stop them. She didn't want a scene to grow bigger. She didn't need anyone to fight for her. Her strength was in the quiet way she carried herself. Her cheek was still red from the slap, but her eyes were steady. She looked at the woman in red, not with hatred, but with a calm that made everyone else more uneasy. The woman in red lowered her head, realizing she had made a terrible mistake. She had let jealousy control her in front of everyone who mattered. She had not only disrespected a woman, but had done it in front of the man who controlled entire industries, in front of people whose respect she had worked so hard to earn. The billionaire whispered something softly to his wife, and she nodded slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone made everyone stand silently. Cameras flashed from the back of the room. Guests held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman in red started trembling, a wave of regret washing over her like cold water. The atmosphere in the hall had changed completely. Just a few minutes earlier, it was a warm, elegant evening filled with music and laughter. Now the lights felt brighter, sharper. The silence grew heavier with each passing second. Everyone could feel that this night would be remembered for what had just happened. The billionaire's wife took a small breath, steady and quiet. She was hurt, but she wasn't broken. The woman in red realized too late that she had not just struck a person. She had struck the heart of a room full of respect, trust, and admiration. The night was no longer hers to control. It belonged to the woman she had tried to embarrass, and the calm silence that followed said more than any loud words ever could. The entire room stood frozen. No one dared to make the first move. The soft sound of the orchestra was gone, and in its place there was only the weight of silence. The woman in red stood with her hand slightly shaking, her breathing quick and shallow. She had always been the kind of person who enjoyed the spotlight, but now that every eye in the room was on her, it felt like the ground beneath her feet was slipping away. She hadn't planned this. She had let her emotions take over, and now she was trapped in a moment she could not undo. The billionaire gently moved closer to his wife. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. His calmness was more powerful than anger. He placed his arm lightly around her shoulder as if to remind everyone in the room that she was protected and respected. His presence gave her strength, but the truth was she didn't look weak at all. Even after being slapped in front of hundreds of people, she stood tall. She looked directly at the woman who had struck her, and in her eyes there was no fear. There was something deeper, quiet strength. Two security guards slowly stepped forward, waiting for the billionaire's signal. They were ready to escort the woman out, but his wife raised her hand gently, asking them to stop. That small movement surprised everyone. She wasn't reacting with rage. She wasn't crying or shouting. She was standing with a calm that made the woman in red even more nervous. Whispers moved through the crowd like a wave. "She's finished," someone whispered softly. "How could she do that?" Another replied. Some people had already pulled out their phones to call their drivers, not because they wanted to leave, but because they knew the situation was going to change everything. This was not a small scandal. It was a moment that would stay in the city's memory for a long time. The woman in red took a few steps backward, her back brushing against a white marble pillar. Her eyes darted from face to face. Everywhere she looked, she saw judgment. A few guests avoided her gaze completely, not wanting to be associated with what she had done. Others stared directly at her, their eyes cold and sharp. She felt the air growing heavy around her. The billionaire slowly turned his head toward her. He didn't say a word. His silence was louder than any voice in the room. His reputation wasn't built on anger, but on quiet control. When he spoke, people listened. And when he didn't, they listened even harder. The woman in red lowered her head as if the weight of his gaze alone had pushed her down. The event organizer walked over nervously, unsure of what to do. This was supposed to be a night of generosity, kindness, and community. Now it was on the edge of turning into chaos. The organizer whispered something to the billionaire, but he raised his hand gently to stop him. This wasn't going to be handled behind closed doors. It had happened in public, and it would be remembered in public too. The woman in red felt her knees go weak. Her earlier pride and loud voice were gone. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't mean to." Her voice cracked halfway through. A few guests shook their heads, some turning away in disappointment. She'd spent years building her image, but it had all fallen apart in less than a minute. The billionaire's wife took one small step forward. Her dress moved gently, and even that soft movement caught the attention of the entire room. Everyone waited for her to speak. She had the power now, not because of money or influence, but because she had remained calm and strong when someone had tried to humiliate her. The woman in red started talking fast, trying to explain herself. I was upset," she said softly. "I didn't mean to." Her voice trembled. It didn't sound strong anymore. She sounded like someone who already knew the damage was done, but the billionaire's wife did not interrupt her. She stood quietly and let her words stumble out. When the woman in red finished speaking, the silence returned. And then in a steady and graceful voice, the billionaire's wife said, "There are moments in life you can't take back. What you did is one of them." Her words were not loud, but they carried across the entire room like a soft wind through glass. No one moved. No one even breathed loudly. The woman in red lowered her eyes, tears forming at the corners. She finally realized that nothing she said could erase what had happened in front of everyone. Behind the crowd, some of the city's most influential people began making quiet calls to their assistants. Her name would be whispered in boardrooms by morning. Doors she once walked through easily would slowly start closing. She had built her career on being admired. Now she was being remembered for something else entirely. The billionaire looked at her and spoke for the first time. His voice was firm and low, but it carried weight. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked quietly. The woman nodded slowly, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to speak. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Everyone could see how serious he was. The woman in red began to cry softly, the sound barely reaching anyone's ears. She realized she hadn't just disrespected a woman. She had disrespected someone who had done nothing but show kindness to everyone in that room. She had turned a night meant for good into a night of shame. The security team took a small step forward again, ready to escort her out. But the billionaire's wife lifted her hand once more. She didn't want to create a scene. She didn't want to be the reason someone was dragged out of a room. But she also wasn't going to pretend nothing had happened. Her silence, her control, and her strength were making the woman in red break down faster than any punishment could have. The woman in red slowly dropped to her knees. Her lipstick was smudged and tears ran down her cheeks. She didn't care who saw her anymore. All the pride she had walked in with was gone. She whispered again, "Please." "I'm sorry." The billionaire didn't answer. He turned toward his wife, waiting for her to decide how to handle it. This was not about his power anymore. It was about hers. She was the one who had been wronged, and she was the one who now held the choice of what would happen next. A guest whispered to another, "She's begging now." Another replied softly, "She should. She crossed the line." The woman in red kept whispering apologies, her hands shaking as she held them together. The billionaire's wife slowly walked toward her. The entire room fell silent again. She stopped just a few steps away from the woman on the floor. Their eyes met, one full of regret, the other calm and unbroken. The woman on the floor couldn't stop crying now. She realized too late how deep the consequences of her action would run. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built, it would all be remembered differently after this night. The billionaire's wife didn't need to say much more. Her calm face, steady eyes, and quiet strength said everything. The night that began with lights, music, and celebration had turned into a moment that would be remembered for years. Not because of a party, not because of the food or the decorations, but because a woman had let jealousy take control, and another woman had chosen dignity instead of anger. And as the woman in red knelt in front of her, the world seemed to understand who truly held the real power in that room. The woman in red was still on her knees, her tears falling on the smooth marble floor. Her hands trembled as she held them together, whispering, "I'm sorry," again and again. The strong, proud image she had carried into the event was gone completely. Around her, people stood in silence, watching something they knew they would never forget. The golden lights of the gala no longer sparkled with the same warmth as before. The night had shifted. It was no longer about music or fancy clothes. It had become a moment that revealed who people truly were. The billionaire's wife stood just a few steps away from her. Her black dress flowed gently around her ankles as she moved closer. She didn't rush and she didn't raise her voice. The room belonged to her now. Everyone waited to see what she would do. Security guards were still on standby, ready to step in if she gave the signal, but she hadn't needed their help once. Her quiet strength had spoken louder than any command could. The woman in red lowered her head, ashamed to even look at her. She had never imagined she would end up kneeling in front of the woman she tried to humiliate. She had wanted to make her look small, but now she was the one who looked small in front of everyone. Her actions had backfired completely. The billionaire's wife slowly took a deep breath. She knew everyone expected her to react. She could have chosen anger. She could have humiliated the woman in front of everyone, but she wasn't that kind of person. She gently lifted her chin and looked around the room. Her eyes met the faces of the guests, the business leaders, the celebrities, the organizers, and the servers standing quietly at the edges of the room. All of them were waiting for her next words. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, steady, and calm. "I will not let this night be remembered for hate," she said simply. The words spread through the room like a quiet wave. Guests blinked, as if they didn't expect such calm from someone who had just been humiliated in front of everyone. The woman in red looked up slowly, tears still running down her face. She didn't understand why this woman wasn't yelling at her. She expected punishment, anger, and rejection, but instead she saw something completely different: grace. The billionaire's wife looked down at her and said, "What you did was wrong. Everyone saw it, and I will not pretend it didn't happen, but I won't let your mistake turn me into someone bitter." Her voice didn't shake. It was the kind of voice that made people listen without being forced to. The woman in red covered her face with her hands and cried harder. In that moment, she realized the difference between herself and the woman she had tried to hurt. She had acted out of jealousy. The billionaire's wife was acting out of strength. That was the difference between power that fades and power that lasts. The billionaire stood nearby, quietly watching his wife. His face softened slightly. He knew her well and he wasn't surprised. She had always been the kind of woman who led with dignity. He didn't need to step in. She was handling it in a way that showed everyone why she was so deeply respected. The woman in red slowly raised her hands as if to touch the billionaire's wife's feet, but stopped halfway. She wasn't doing it for drama. It came from pure regret. She had realized she had destroyed her own image in front of everyone. She whispered, "Please, forgive me." Her voice cracked as the words left her lips. The billionaire's wife took another breath and said, "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened, but it shows who we choose to be after it." Then she turned her back to the woman. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was a way of saying that the woman's actions would no longer control her night. The security guards looked at her, waiting for instructions. She simply nodded slightly, a sign that she didn't want any more drama. One of the organizers walked over to the woman in red and gently helped her stand up. Her legs shook as she rose and she held onto the edge of the pillar for balance. No one clapped. No one smiled. The silence in the room was heavy, not with hate but with understanding. Everyone now knew who had acted with dignity and who had lost it. The woman in red avoided looking at anyone. Her face was wet with tears and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She knew the damage had already been done. No speech, no excuse, no apology could take it back. Her name would travel through the city the next day, not for her business or wealth, but for this single moment that showed the world her true character. Meanwhile, the billionaire gently took his wife's hand. He leaned close and whispered something soft that only she could hear. She smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of peace. She knew she had chosen strength over anger, and that was enough for her. The orchestra quietly began to play again, soft and slow, as if trying to bring some warmth back into the night. The guests slowly began talking in low voices. They weren't talking about business anymore. They were talking about what they had just witnessed. Some said, "She is the strongest woman I've ever seen." Others whispered, "That was grace, real grace." And many people, including those who barely knew her, felt a new kind of respect growing in their hearts. The woman in red was escorted toward the exit quietly. She didn't fight it. She didn't look back. She had learned a lesson in the most painful and public way possible. She had thought strength came from power, but now she understood it came from character. The billionaire's wife walked back toward the center of the room with her husband. People made way for her with quiet respect. She didn't walk like a victim. She walked like someone who owned her moment without letting it break her. Her cheek was still slightly red, but her head was high. and her steps were calm. An older woman standing near the table whispered to her daughter, "People will remember this night for her strength, not the slap." By the end of the evening, when the guests slowly began to leave, the atmosphere had completely changed. There was no anger left, only quiet admiration. The woman in red had lost her image, but the billionaire's wife had gained something even stronger: deep respect. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't humiliated anyone. She had chosen dignity, and that choice made her unforgettable. As the billionaire's car pulled up outside, he opened the door for his wife like he always did. The night air was cool, and the stars sparkled softly above them. She took one last look at the hotel behind her, knowing this moment would be talked about for years. She didn't need to say anything. Her silence had already spoken louder than 1,000 words. In the coming weeks, many people who had been at that event would talk about it. But their words would not be about the woman in red's anger. They would be about the calm, strong woman who turned humiliation into power. And somewhere deep inside, the woman in red would remember this night too. Not as a proud moment, but as a lesson she would never forget.